This is Fiona Cuthbertson coming from the pod to record another episode of Off the Cuff. As a starting point, we do need to mention that this podcast is part of the Podcasten charity initiative, where over 1,500 podcasts are dedicated to a specific charitable cause. When it came to choosing a charity, it was obvious to me that it needed to be Scoliosis Support and Research. It not only looks at researching the causes of this condition, but supporting the families of those who are affected. The problems caused by scoliosis include back problems, issues with compressed organs and nerve damage, and not dealing with it quickly really does impact the sufferer. My 13-year-old daughter has double scoliosis and just last November had a 7.5-hour spinal fusion operation where they put 2.25 kilograms of titanium in her back to strengthen her spine and straighten it. Without it, she'd have undoubtedly ended up crippled, and instead she spent this term undertaking a 100-mile walk to raise funds for SSR and have raised almost £2,500 as quality of life has been transformed. To talk with us today about such health issues and other subjects is Sharon Hodgson MP. Welcome, Sharon.
Hello, thanks for having me, Fiona.
So firstly, can you tell us about your political journey?
Oh gosh, I've been an MP now for 21 years, first elected in 2005. Prior to that, I worked for a trade union as a political officer, Unison, and prior to that, I worked for the Labour Party for a number of years as an organiser. And prior to that, I had a normal life. And it was a bit of my hobby, being a Labour Party member, volunteer, activist, knocking on doors for the 97 election was my first campaign. So my hobby became my job and then literally took over my life, which is what being an MP is like. I didn't grow up in a political family. Nobody in my family before me had been a member of any political party, although there was lots of shouting at the telly during Thatcher years. So I was in a small P political family, although nobody was active. There were voters and they had opinions. So my mum, my nana, my aunties, nobody liked Margaret Thatcher in my house growing up. So I was very aware nobody wanted her to win. And then when she did win in 1979, I was aware of what happened to the Northeast and to my community. Everyone lost their jobs. I had a babysitting job for my cousin, but she emigrated to Australia with her husband, Canada first, I think, then Australia, because she said didn't want to live in a country with Margaret Thatcher as Prime Minister. At 13, I lost my babysitting job and then left school and struggled to get a job. My brother struggled to get jobs. Everyone lost their jobs. The mines shut, the steelworks shut, the shipyards shut. So it made me realise that who is in power that matters and politics matters. And then it was after I was married and had my kids in the run up to the 97 election that I remember looking at my two little kids and thinking, wow, you know, we lost in 92 and I didn't do anything to help us win in 92, although I took the day off work to watch it on the telly as we lost. And then I thought, it matters. We need to win this election in 97. So Tony Blair, I always say Tony Blair asked me to join because he came on the telly on a party political broadcast and said, if you want Labour to win the next election, I need you. You need to join. So I did. And I volunteered and got the bug, started knocking on doors. They often say people get addicted to gambling. If the first time they gamble, they win. Well, that happened to me with politics because the first time I campaigned, we won. And so that was it. I was hooked.
And your career has all been about ensuring that unseen issues are brought to the stage. So what has that given you about how policy and legislative change can help constituents?
Coming in, I came in with this sort of feeling of injustice for the North-South divide, and people from backgrounds such as mine weren't dealt a good hand. You had a harder time with things. So I very much felt I was fighting for the underdog and for the Northeast and for issues. And so child poverty has always been something that drove me, and that probably is why I fought for universal access to universal free school meals and so many other things that I came across, like the reselling of tickets for huge profit, because that was about a social justice point of view, that tickets to see favourite artist or band or sport shouldn't be to the highest bidder. that there should be a much fairer way, because people on minimum wage or on benefits should be able to save up, or a kid on that pocket money should be able to save up and go and say something. It shouldn't go to those with the deepest pockets. The Washington that I represented didn't have the metro, although the whole of Tyne-and-Wear was served by the metro. The Washington is the fourth biggest town in the whole of the country that didn't have a rail link. So campaigning for the metro was a massive thing I got involved in. Other issues, I had a stillborn baby at 23 and a half weeks, and she was classed as a miscarriage because it's 24 weeks to be recognised as stillbirth. So I campaigned eventually for something called baby loss certificates that people have access to. If you lose a baby before 24 weeks, you can still get a recognition that there was a baby. So all of these things, special educational needs I've done over the years as well. I had a private members bill. And then recently as well, again, health scandals. When I was Shadow Public Health Minister, this issue of mesh and then something called sodium valproate and a drug called Primados that had caused terrible health deformities and deaths in for babies, mothers who took those drugs. The use of mesh in women for stress urinary incontinence had caused the most terrible, debilitating pain and life-changing disabilities in some women, and including, as it turned out, my own mum. So that all led to a campaign I've now been involved in for well over 10 years. And under the last government, I campaigned for a public inquiry, and Jeremy Hunt, who was then Health Secretary, and Theresa May, I have to say, when she was Prime Minister, launched a review that was then named First Do No Harm into mesh, Primados and valproate. And that has been something I've been involved in and still involved in for the 10 years since then, campaigning for justice. So all of these issues are sort of different, but all connected in that sort of trying to be the voice for the voiceless and to make changes to help people.
As you say, it is all about making sure that people have a voice even when they don't. And I did mention in my introduction that this podcast is dedicated to sufferers of scoliosis. It isn't disability that's not often on people's radar, but for sufferers, it is pretty fundamental. Organs being displaced, cognitive impairment, you can't relax, you can't ever settle. Doesn't this show that people need to be more understanding of others and the battles that they fight, and also that more support needs to be given to issues like this by government in order to make sure that cures and research is actually undertaken?
Absolutely. It's just so important. I had a former member of staff who'd had surgery for scoliosis as well, and ongoing health issues, and I think it had been very successful, the surgery, but still he was very aware that he had to stay fit and look after himself. And I wasn't aware of all of the other ongoing health issues that it can bring. But for so many people, these can be hidden disabilities and hidden conditions. Nobody, especially once you've had the surgery, would even notice that someone might be still suffering from scoliosis and had that surgery, because we don't go around wearing badges of what might be wrong or what we might have gone through in our life. And the support medically from the NHS over people's lives and the research that is therefore needed into these conditions and more is so important to ensure that people are getting the right support that they need for the rest of their life. And we hear about postcode lotteries within our country, within the NHS, but worse than that is when you compare what services are in other countries. There's some work I've been doing with glioblastoma, because we lost Tessa Jowell, is a household name, but someone not as well known but very important to the party is Margaret McDonagh, who was the General Secretary of the Labour Party when I worked for the party, and I was her sister Siobhan McDonagh's organiser for the 2001 election, when that was a part of my journey through the party to eventually becoming an MP. And Margaret McDonagh died of glioblastoma not long over a year after, maybe 18 months after her first diagnosis. And at one point she was going to Germany for treatment because there was a treatment available in Germany that wasn't available here. And you hear that so often. So it's not just the postcode lottery here, it's the international postcode lottery. And so we need to ensure that we are one of the richest countries in the world, the fifth, sixth biggest economy. And so our health service should be on par with that and make sure that our citizens get some of the best healthcare in the world.
Absolutely. And how can you make sure that the NHS is able to provide the services that we need in order to make sure that these conditions are actually dealt with?
So it's free at the point of use, but it's paid for from general taxation. And everyone wants Swedish healthcare on American levels of taxation. The thing is, we want the best healthcare in the world, and it has to be paid for. And I think what people demand is that money spent wisely. And that's one of the things that Wes Streeting, our health secretary, is trying to ensure. One of the reasons he scrapped NHS England is because all that extra level of bureaucracy wasn't actually achieving any extra results for patients. And yet there was this whole other tier of bureaucracy and jobs that was just duplicated and probably causing blockages of admin and red tape that just wasn't needed. So that is one of the things that he really is trying to take seriously, that everyone probably feels they're paying as much tax as they can stomach at the moment, but then they also feel they couldn't get a GP appointment, they couldn't get to see their dentist. There was treatments available, other treatments in other countries that weren't available here. So Wes is really trying to make sure that the NHS is the best that it can be. And he's only a year, 18 months into the job. So I think we're going to see far more improvements. And I hope people do start to see those improvements. He announced all the extra funding to have more GPs. There's already been extra funding for dentists and golden handshakes to encourage dentists to go to parts of the country where there's a shortage of NHS dentists at the moment. And so they'll go in like places like my constituency rather than maybe the leafy suburbs of Surrey or Sussex, for instance, and then hopefully after they might stay. So we need the NHS to be equitable and for people to have access to the best treatment available, not just if you live in London. It should be the same no matter where you live.
Absolutely. And coming back to the fact that often women's issues regarding mesh aren't taken into consideration as much as they should be, we often have a big issue around violence against women and girls as well. So why is it so important to deal with that issue?
We're supposed to have equality, and we supposedly had equal pay now since the women at the Ford plant in Dagenham fought for it all those years ago. But as we know, both of those things are not necessarily everyone's experience. We still don't have equal pay, and we still don't have full equality. There's still a glass ceiling and all of that. And because of that, sometimes women can still be seen as not important. When we were talking about mesh in valproate and Primados, there's an element of medical misogyny there, in my opinion, because these are all issues that predominantly affect women and their children. And the fact that we're still having to fight after all this time, some of these, Primados was a drug given to people in the late 60s and 70s. Valproate is still obviously being given to people now, but without necessarily always giving them the advice if they're of childbearing years that they should not get pregnant while, or even try for a baby or consider having a baby whilst on that drug. And then in mesh, of course, mesh mainly is something that's being used for women. Nobody likes us to be talking about medical misogyny because nobody wants to believe that exists. We need to ensure that women's voices are heard when women go to the police and report crimes, rapes, that they're taken seriously, that they're not frightened to report these things. But so often people think, well, it's not going to be taken seriously. I'm going to be made out to be the bad guy. It's going to be my fault. Will anybody believe me? Will anything happen? Will this lead to a prosecution? And the prosecution rates for rape and sexual assault are so small. So many women just think, what's the point? And we can't have that being the case. And we need cultural changes. We need to start with educating our boys and men better. If we try and create a different society, we don't want boys to go into men who assault women. That should be so abhorrent that would even happen. We might never ever eradicate it fully. I don't live in a utopia in my head, but if the culture changes, if society changes, if it's deemed not as acceptable, like the jokes and the banter, and everybody thinks that's harmless. Well, it's not, because it becomes allowable, it becomes acceptable, and then women viewed in a different way. And we've got to ensure that there's that respect in society, and that The same way I think racism is viewed now as unacceptable, we need sexism to be viewed in the same way and be as abhorrent. But quite often, where somebody wouldn't make a racist joke anymore, they'll still make sexist jokes and not think anything of it. And I think it becomes pervasive in society that leads to the level of violence against women that we see.
Absolutely. When you first got elected, there was just a constituency mailbag, and now you obviously have an email. So spiteful and hateful things can be leveled at you 24/7. And also what it's like to be targeted with the destruction of your office. So just coming back to that briefly, if you don't mind, can you tell us how that felt and how you came back stronger?
As you say, from the post bag where you might get a dozen, 2 dozen letters a day to the hundreds and hundreds of emails we get a day, and the posts on Facebook and Instagram and Twitter. And I have a buffer, thankfully, between all of that. And that buffer is my wonderful team of staff. I've got an amazing team, 6.5 members, and they perform that buffer. I try not to look at the emails all coming in. I get the ones that are sent on to me by my team, and the same with Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. I don't post on Twitter anymore. I'm on Blue Sky, which is a much better platform, and I try not to doom scroll and I never search my name or look for what anybody's saying about me. So you have to put those protections in place if you're in public life, and especially as a woman in public life. I remember I used to say all the personal comments about my appearance and my size and or what I was wearing. And as much as you think, oh, it's a load of rubbish, I'm not going to read any of that. Once you've read it, it's gone in. And it's hard not to let those things affect you. So you've got to distance yourself from that. But what was hard to distance myself from was the attacks on my office. Like I was graffitied with genocide enabler and lots of stuff around the conflict between Israel and Gaza, a number of attacks and protests at my office, which was just awful. But again, more awful for my staff, who they haven't necessarily signed up for that. They've applied for a job and they're doing their best. They haven't stood for election and put their name on a ballot paper, and yet they were having their place of work attacked like this. And then, as you mentioned, the actual destruction of my office was, I'll never know whether it was targeted at me, because the guy who did it hasn't been charged, he's in custody, but he hasn't been sentenced yet. It says that he didn't know I was the MP and he didn't know it was my office and it wasn't personal. We can only take his word for it, but nevertheless, he wrecked my office, set fire to it, and it's totally destroyed. And as much as that was very inconvenient for me and my staff, because we haven't got an office now, the one I feel more worried about are the neighbours who also lost their offices. There was a charity that Neiman Pick that did wonderful work for the people who suffered with that disease, and there was an NHS office treatment centre for people suffering with addictions. Both of those facilities were destroyed. And for my poor landlord, that was 3 of his offices. That was part of his livelihood, his business, that are now totally destroyed. We could all walk away and say, all right, we'll have to go and find a new office. But he was left with 3 wrecked offices that need demolishing now. So these things have real life consequences, and I try not to feel vulnerable any more than I did already, being aware that you've got to look after yourself, especially after what happened to Joe Cox and David Amos, the 2 MPs who were murdered while going about their duties as constituency MPs, going to their surgeries. You know, you've got to be conscious all the time that you're in a public facing role. The fact that the chap who did it said he didn't know I was the MP, I do try and take some comfort from that. Might be the truth, and that I wasn't targeted for my job. It would just happen to, for whatever reason, he was wanted to destroy something. He was hitting out at the world, and my office just happened to be the one he destroyed. But in the back of my head, I always think, was it targeted? Will I ever know? So it's, you haven't got to let it stop you from doing what you're trying to do. And all of us who stand to a public life, be councillors or MPs or public servants, the doctors, the nurses, the teachers, the firefighters, the police, everyone goes into those lines of work because you want to give something back, you want to help people. And you have to recognise that there can be a downside to that. I just think about the police, what they face in their day-to-day lives, and what are our armed forces with what's going on in the world, and people, they literally put their life on the line to fight for their country. So many other public sector, public facing jobs that have far harder things to deal with on a day-to-day basis.
You mentioned the international side, and you are actually leader of the UK delegation to the Parliamentary Assembly of the Organisation for Security and Cooperation in Europe. So how important is that role in this day and age?
Oh, it's so increasingly important. If it ever was important back in the Cold War days, it probably is just as important now with what's happening in the war in Ukraine after what they'd already invaded Crimea 12 years previously and thought they got away with it. So, and the OSCE is made up of representatives from 57 countries, the global north, if you will, and it's the less well-known organisation to NATO, but we are made up of representatives of over 1 billion people in those 57 nations, and we come together. So I'm very proud to lead the UK delegation, and we've just been in Vienna for our winter meeting, and there was a number of topics, very important topics under discussion. And one of the things we do is also is the election monitoring. It's one of the key organisations that goes, and secures that free and fair elections around the world. Because as we know, democracy is one of the first things to go. And if that goes, you end up with situations as we see in Russia. We know there Putin isn't elected under free and fair elections. We carry on monitoring those elections and encouraging democracy around the world and encouraging the dialogue and diplomacy, because as much as we all want Ukraine to win, they probably aren't going to win militarily. We obviously don't want Russia to win militarily, but the only way this conflict will end is through diplomacy, is getting around the table, sitting down. The UN does amazing work on that, and the small part I can play in ensuring we have no more conflicts, but that the conflicts that we do have end as soon as possible is something I'm very proud to be playing a part in.
And you also are the UK trade envoy in Japan as well, and your constituency is home to a lot of Japanese firms. So how do you ensure that national policy really does help your local area?
So obviously, I talked about growing up in the Northeast and the devastation when the shipyards and the mines and the steelworks all closed, and all of those men, it was mainly men, all thrown onto unemployment, some for the rest of their life. And so one small thing, I mentioned Margaret Thatcher, and obviously we can blame her for a lot of that, but one of the things we have to thank her for is the deal she then struck with Nissan in 1986. Nissan wanted a big factory in Europe, and she brought Nissan to the UK, and not just the UK, but they came to Sunderland. The plant is now still, all these years later, going strong in my constituency, employs 7,000 people directly and 32,000 in the surrounding supply chain. And as you've mentioned, lots of those companies, Nissan, obviously Japanese companies, and the AESC that manufactures the batteries for the electric vehicles, a Japanese company as well, so Japanese-Chinese partnership. So the link with Japan in my constituency was very important. And so when we got into government and I was asked if I would take on the role as being the UK trade envoy to Japan, I was absolutely delighted and jumped at the chance, because I already had always made the time to engage with the Japanese ambassador. And I was a member of the all-party group, the Britain-Japan all-party group. So to be able to take that role further on behalf of the whole UK and to use some of those connections I've made over the years, and it was a great opportunity. I'm thoroughly enjoying it. I've been once last May, and our British Embassy in Japan helped, together with the Department for Business and Trade, organise the mission. They call them trade missions. And I'm going again in March for my second delegation. And so there'll be an amazing itinerary. I think this time we're going to be looking at life sciences, pharmaceuticals, and clean energy, which is so important. And for Northeast companies, This is why Nissan has stayed all this time, and the other companies have also based themselves in the Northeast. There was a reason the Industrial Revolution was led by parts of the country like the Northeast, but also the Northwest. There's something in the DNA of us in the Northeast that manufacturing, heavy manufacturing, just the skills, those jobs really appeal to the Northeast workforce, because Nissan wouldn't have stayed in the Northeast if the workforce wasn't productive and wasn't making the money. And it is. And the people who have those jobs, men and women now, although it's still predominantly men, whenever I go around Nissan, I'm always thrilled when I see women on the production lines and in the various roles. They love it and they're good at it, and they're really well paid jobs. So yeah, if I can bring more of those Japanese companies to come and invest here in the UK, across the country, all the better. But also the opportunities for export, for our companies here to be doing trade with Japan. It's a role I'm really enjoying.
So finally, are you positive about the business interests of the Northeast and the UK as a whole?
Oh, absolutely. The situation we inherited, country's finances were in a dire state. And the only way to improve that and to improve the cost of living crisis that everyone feels is to grow the economy. And so that has been the main focus of this government. We have to grow the economy in order that the pie's bigger for everyone to get a better slice of that pie and to feel that their own life's improved. We were talking about the NHS. The only way to get more money for the NHS is whatever percentage the government is paying. And in the height of the Tony Blair government, we were paying 6% of GDP a year. So you need that GDP to be big. And I don't even think we're back up to 6%. It went down under the Tories to about 1.5%. And that's how the NHS really got worse. So we need the percentage that we pay towards public services to increase. But in order for it to increase, we need the pie to be bigger. So those opportunities, businesses in the Northeast, but across the country as well, to thrive is so, so important. And I think the rates of employment, we're seeing there's more jobs available. And this is why we increased the minimum wage. And I know it meant some businesses have struggled because there was the NI increase and the employer's NI increase at the same time as the increase in the minimum wage. But the NI increases for the country to have more money to spend, but the minimum wage increase gave people more money to spend in their local communities. And it's that circular economy. If people have got more money to spend, then they'll go out to pubs and restaurants, they'll buy more clothes at the local shops, which means the factories making the clothes have to make more clothes. They'll go get their hair done more often, get their nails done. So it's important to do all of those things. And as I say, we've only been 18 months. There's been 6 Bank of England interest rates cut. We've got the lowest inflation we've had for quite some time now. So I think we are seeing, and nobody ever wants to say the green shoots of recovery, but I've just said it. So I hope that this is the signs of the green shoots of recovery and people will start to feel better off very soon.
Sharon, thank you so much for coming to talk to us today. It's been really interesting to hear about how the government need to continue ensuring the health and education of our population can go from strength to strength, and also that no matter what anyone's disabilities or where they started in life, they can have a fulfilling life in the United Kingdom. Thank you to you, the viewers, who've hopefully enjoyed the show as much as we've enjoyed making it. If you have any questions regarding the podcast, please feel free to comment. And if you think it's worth coming back, please like and subscribe. And if you're interested in knowing more about Scoliosis Support and Research, go to ssr.org.uk and you'll even be able to see a blog story about Lillian. And on that note, I'll see you next time. I hope you have a good week, one and all.